The Statue of Liberty was black, not the copper, not the green, the idea, the design, the soul of her. And once you hear this story, you'll never look at her the same way again. Before Lady Liberty ever stood in New York Harbor, she was supposed to stand somewhere else, somewhere far more powerful, somewhere older. She was supposed to stand in Egypt. Here's what most people don't know. The whole concept of a giant robed woman holding a torch to the sky didn't start as an American idea. It started as an African one. A French sculptor traveled through Egypt in the 1850s. He walked past the pyramids. He stood in front of the Sphinx, and what he saw broke something open in his mind. He saw giants, massive stone figures that had stood for thousands of years, watching over the land, untouched by time, radiating power that Europe had never come close to matching. He was young then, barely into his 20s, and he'd already carved his first commissioned statue back home in France before he'd even turned 20. But nothing prepared him for the Nile. He traveled with a group of painters chasing the same obsession, capturing the East on canvas and film before it changed forever. Cameras were still a novelty, and he lugged his equipment up and down the riverbank, photographing ruins that outlasted empires. But it wasn't the photographs that changed him. It was standing at the feet of stone giants at Abu Simbel, colossal seated pharaohs carved directly into a mountainside, each one taller than a 4-story building. He stood there and felt something most people never feel in front of art. He felt small, genuinely small. And he decided right then that this was the kind of art he wanted to make for the rest of his life. So he decided to build his own giant. And when he designed her, he didn't dress her like a Greek goddess. He didn't dress her like a European queen. He wrapped her in the robes of Egyptian peasant women, the Falaha, strong women, working women, women who carried water on their heads under the desert sun every single day of their lives. That was his model. Not marble statues in European museums. Real African women he saw with his own eyes. He called her Egypt carrying the light to Asia. She was supposed to stand at the mouth of the Suez Canal, torch raised high, welcoming ships into African waters, a lighthouse, a guardian. In some of his early sketches, she didn't even hold the torch in her hand. He toyed with the idea of the light coming straight off her head, the way village women balance water jars. Light carried the same way life-giving water was carried, right there on top of her skull, native style, not European style. That detail alone tells you how deeply this design was rooted in what he'd actually witnessed in Egypt, not in some European fantasy of the East. He pitched this to the ruler of Egypt at the time, a Khedive who governed the country during one of its most ambitious and most financially reckless eras. And the ruler said no, not because the idea was weak, not because he hated it. In fact, by most accounts, he was intrigued. He even got involved enough to suggest changes to the design himself. But Egypt was broke. The Suez Canal had already drained the treasury dry. There was no money left for giant statues, no matter how badly Egypt deserved one. The canal alone cost a fortune that would take Egypt generations to recover from, and the ruler who once dreamed of turning Cairo into a piece of Europe was now watching his country slide toward foreign financial control. A 100-foot bronze and stone goddess was simply not a bill Egypt could afford to pay, no matter how much prestige she promised. So the statue never got built there. Not yet. Instead, Egypt built something smaller and cheaper at the mouth of that same canal, a modest working lighthouse, functional but forgettable. Nothing like the towering guardian that had once been imagined for that spot. A footnote where a monument should have stood. But here's where it gets wild. The Frenchman didn't throw away the drawings. He kept her. He kept the robes. He kept the torch. He kept the whole shape of her in his mind. He just needed a new country willing to pay for her. A few years later, France wanted to hand America a gift, something huge, something that stood for freedom. And guess what design got pulled back out of the drawer? Same woman, same torch, same robes, just a new name and a new home. Egypt carrying the light to Asia became Liberty enlightening the world. The statue that was supposed to stand guard over African waters ended up standing guard over New York Harbor instead. Let that sink in. The most famous statue in America started as an Egyptian idea. Her whole concept, a robed woman holding light for the world, was born on African soil, shaped by African women, and rejected by an African ruler only because of money, not because the design was wrong. She was Egyptian before she was ever American. Now, here's the part that really matters. Why did that Frenchman feel the need to build something so massive in the first place? Because Egypt had already been doing it for thousands of years before he ever set foot there. Ancient Egypt didn't just build statues, they built giants. The Sphinx, massive stone pharaohs carved from single blocks of rock, standing taller than buildings, guarding temples for thousands of years without crumbling. Long before France existed, long before America existed, Egypt had already mastered the art of building enormous protective figures meant to inspire awe in anyone who stood in front of them. That's not a small compliment from a sculptor. That's a man admitting that Africa had already perfected the exact art form he'd spend the rest of his career chasing. So when people say the Statue of Liberty is black, this is what they're pointing to: her spirit, her roots, her entire reason for existing came from Africa first. Everything grand about her, the size, the robes, the torch, the message of guiding light, traces straight back to African tradition, African monuments, African women. And think about where this all was supposed to happen: the Suez Canal. That canal changed the entire world. It connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, cutting straight through Egyptian land, letting ships sail from Europe to Asia without going all the way around Africa. That single project reshaped global commerce in one stroke, and it did it by carving a channel through Egyptian soil. And who dug that canal out by hand? Egyptian workers, thousands of them, under brutal, exhausting conditions, moving earth with basic tools, giving their labor and their sweat and sometimes their lives to build something that changed how the entire world moved goods and ships. For years, much of that labor was compulsory. Ordinary farmers pulled away from their own fields and forced to dig for a foreign company's canal, paid little or nothing, working under a system that left them with no real choice in the matter. The original Statue of Liberty was supposed to stand watch over that canal, torch raised high, celebrating a canal built by African hands. Instead, that finish line got a modest lighthouse, and the goddess who should have crowned it sailed off to a different harbor entirely. When Egypt couldn't pay, the whole idea packed up and sailed across the ocean, where it got a new identity, a new flag, and eventually became the single most photographed symbol of American freedom on the planet. Nobody standing on Liberty Island today thinks about any of that. Nobody thinks about Egyptian peasant women carrying water under the desert sun. Nobody thinks about a ruler shaking his head and saying, "There's no money right now." Nobody thinks about the thousands of Egyptian laborers who tore that canal out of the earth with their bare hands and basic tools. They just see a green copper woman holding a torch, and they call her American. But long before she was American, she was African. Now let's talk about how the switch actually happened, because this part is almost too neat to believe. Around the same years the Egyptian project was falling apart, a French political thinker floated an entirely different idea across the Atlantic, a joint gift from France to the United States, something to mark 100 years of American independence and to celebrate the two nations' shared belief in liberty and the end of slavery. That idea sat quietly for a while, half-formed, waiting for a shape. The sculptor was busy elsewhere, sketching lighthouse goddesses for a canal that would never get her. But once the Egyptian door closed, he didn't let the idea die. Between roughly 1870 and 1871, he sat down with those old Suez sketches and started changing them piece by piece. The distinctly Egyptian dress of the fellaha slowly gave way to flowing Greek-style robes. The light that once beamed from the top of her head moved down into an upraised torch instead. A simple head covering became a spiked diadem. A free hand that once hung at her side was given a tablet to hold, inscribed with a date that had nothing to do with Egypt at all, July 4th, 1776. Piece by piece, an Egyptian peasant woman was redressed as a Roman goddess of liberty. He sailed to New York not long after to pitch this reworked idea directly to American leaders, walking the harbor, scouting a small island that ships would have to pass on their way into port, meeting with the sitting American president to talk through where such a statue might stand. It's the same instinct that drove the original Suez proposal. Position her where every ship has no choice but to sail past her, torch raised, impossible to ignore. Only now the water beneath her would be New York Harbor instead of the Suez Canal. Later in his life, when critics in America accused him of simply recycling an Egyptian design, he pushed back hard, insisting the two statues were different creations born from different ideas. Maybe in his mind they were, but look at the sketches side by side, the earliest Suez proposal next to the finished Liberty design, and the resemblance speaks for itself. A robed woman, an upraised arm, a torch lighting the way for ships entering a harbor. The bones are the same bones, only the clothing changed. There's another layer to this that most retellings skip entirely: money. Getting the reworked statue built in America wasn't automatic just because the design was ready. France agreed to pay for the statue itself, but America was supposed to cover the pedestal she'd stand on. And for years, that funding effort stalled. Wealthy donors weren't exactly lining up to bankroll a giant copper woman nobody had asked for. It took a newspaper publisher launching a public campaign, asking ordinary Americans, factory workers, immigrants, school children, to send in whatever spare change they could afford to finally raise the money. Thousands of small donations, $1 here, a few cents there, is what actually built the base she stands on today. In a strange way, the statue that began as a monument to Egyptian labor ended up being finished by the pooled labor and pennies of ordinary working people all over again, just on a different continent. And look closely at what she still carries, even in her final American form, and you can see the layers stacked on top of each other like sediment. Scholars have long pointed out how much her overall silhouette echoes older goddess imagery, robed female figures associated with light, guidance, and protection, A visual language that shows up again and again across centuries of art, from ancient Egyptian goddess imagery all the way through Roman personifications of liberty itself. The sculptor wasn't inventing a brand new visual vocabulary out of thin air. He was pulling from a deep, ancient well of symbols, and the deepest part of that well runs straight back through Egypt. It doesn't stop there. This wasn't a one-time coincidence either. This is a pattern that runs through history over and over again. Ancient Africa built massive, symbolic, human-shaped monuments meant to represent power and protection long before Europe figured out how to do it. Some of those structures were so heavy, so precisely built, that modern engineers today still study how ancient builders managed to move and lift them without the machines we have today. Think about the sheer logistics of it. Statues weighing hundreds of tons, quarried from stone dozens of miles away, transported across desert and river, then lifted and positioned with a precision that still humbles engineers working with modern cranes and hydraulics. No steel cables, no combustion engines, no blueprints in the way we understand them today. Just extraordinary organization, extraordinary patience, and an extraordinary understanding of physics passed down through generations of builders who never wrote a textbook about it because they didn't need to. They just built it, and it's still standing. The idea of a towering guardian figure holding something aloft, light, power, protection, isn't a European invention. It's one of the oldest artistic traditions on Earth, and Africa was doing it first, doing it bigger, and doing it with a level of skill that still leaves modern engineers scratching their heads trying to figure out the how. The Frenchman didn't invent the idea of the colossal guardian statue. He borrowed it, he repackaged it, and because of how history gets written and who gets to write it, the credit went to Europe and America, while the roots buried in Africa got renamed and forgotten. Think about how differently this story gets told depending on who's telling it. In most museum placards, in most textbooks, in most tourist pamphlets handed out on the ferry to Liberty Island, the story starts in France. It starts with French engineering, French copper, French craftsmanship, a French gift to a young American republic. All true, all real. But it's only half the story, and it's the half that leaves out the desert, the peasant woman, the rejected Khedive, and the thousands of laborers who tore a canal by hand so a lighthouse could one day stand at its mouth. That's the real story, not a rumor, not a guess, a documented fact sitting in sketchbooks and letters and museum archives for anyone willing to look. The first design for a giant robed woman holding a torch was created for Egypt, inspired by Egypt, rejected in Egypt over money, and then reused for the statue that now stands in New York Harbor. The bones of Lady Liberty are African bones. Her spirit was born watching over African waters, meant to honor African labor, standing on the same land that gave the world some of its oldest and most powerful guardian statues thousands of years before her. So the next time somebody tells you the Statue of Liberty is a purely American symbol, you'll know better. You'll know her real story started with someone standing frozen in front of ancient Egyptian giants, so shaken by what he saw that he tried to build his own version of it. You'll know that before she ever raised her torch over New York, she was supposed to raise it over the Suez Canal, welcoming ships past the very land that first taught the world how to build a colossal guardian. You'll know the true root of liberty isn't French, isn't American, it's African. And once you know a story like that, you can't unknow it. It changes how you look at that statue forever. It makes you wonder what else got left out of the books, what other famous designs, famous monuments, famous ideas actually started in Africa and got renamed somewhere else along the way. Think about how many other Western symbols might have quiet, uncredited roots somewhere else entirely, an idea born in one place, refined in another, and finally claimed by whichever nation had the money and the platform to build it big and put a flag on top of it. The Statue of Liberty isn't unique in that sense. She's just one of the clearest, best documented examples of it, sitting in plain sight in one of the most photographed harbors on Earth. Her original blueprints hiding in plain view in a museum most visitors walk straight past without a second glance. That question alone is worth chasing, because history isn't only about what happened, it's about who gets remembered for it. It's about whose sketchbook gets framed in a museum and whose labor gets left out of the plaque underneath it. Egypt gave the world an idea. Somebody else borrowed it. America wore it proudly for over a century. And most people walking past that statue right now have no idea where her story actually begins. Now you do. And it's worth saying plainly, this isn't a fringe theory pulled from some forgotten corner of the internet. This is documented in the museum on Liberty Island itself, in the sculptor's own letters and watercolors, in the biographies written about him, in the archives of the country that almost got to keep her. The evidence isn't hidden. It's just rarely centered. It's a footnote in most tellings instead of the headline it deserves to be. And that gap between what's documented and what's actually told is exactly where stories like this one live. And here's something worth sitting with before we close this out. The next time you see a photo of that statue, on a postcard, in a movie, on the back of a coin, try picturing her the way she almost was. Bronze or stone instead of copper, standing not in a cold northern harbor, but under the desert sun at Port Said, torch blazing over ships entering the Suez Canal, surrounded by the very land and the very people who inspired her in the first place. That statue exists too, in a way. Not in New York, in sketchbooks, in watercolors, in the imagination of a young sculptor who once stood frozen in front of ancient Egyptian giants and decided the world needed one more. If this opened your eyes even a little, if this made you look at something familiar in a completely new way, that's what real history is supposed to do. It's not supposed to just repeat what you already know. It's supposed to hand you the missing pieces and let you put the picture back together yourself. So if you want more stories like this, the hidden roots, the buried connections, the history that got renamed and rewritten, make sure you hit subscribe, because this is only the beginning.